In the last video, we implemented these two callbacks of onSignIn and onSignOut. We made sure that we called both those anytime that the user clicked on either the sign out button or the sign in button right here. Now at the end of the last video, I was looking at both these callback methods we just put together, and I realized that the naming of them is really unclear. They are named onSignIn and onSignOut. I don't know about you, but when I see the term onSignIn, it makes me think that the user just successfully signed in. But that is not the intent of this callback function right here. OnSignIn is supposed to be called when the user is attempting to first sign in. And so in order to make that a little bit more clear, I think that we should probably change the name of both these event handlers. So I'm going to change onSignIn to onSignInClick and onSignOut to onSignOutClick. So the idea here is that this name is a little bit more descriptive. This is a function that is going to be called when the sign in button is clicked. There's no functional change here. Again, it's just to communicate functionality to other engineers who might work on our project. Now, since we updated these event handler names, we need to make sure that we update the references down in both the buttons as well. So I'm going to change this to onSignOutClick and onSignInClick, like so. Okay, so now in this video, we're going to continue by talking about how this component, our Google Auth component, is going to play around with Redux, because we have not yet integrated Redux into our application. So I'm going to show you two different possible ways in which we might integrate this Google authentication with Redux. All right, so here's the first way. The first way that I'm showing you right here is essentially going to leave our Google Auth component for the most part untouched. Now this way that I'm showing you right here is not closely following the conventions of Redux. So I would say that if we wanted to 100% follow Redux conventions, this might not be the best approach. The reason we're going to take this approach right here is that at the end of this project, you are going to end up with a single component, this Google Auth component, that shows you the entire OAuth process with Google from start to finish. And that's what I really want you to have. I want you to have a component that shows you from start to finish how to set up Google OAuth. So even though this is not super optimal, it's still going to leave you with a single reference for, hey, here is how OAuth works. Okay, so let's walk through this flow, and then I'll show you an alternate flow that more closely follows Redux conventions. All right, so inside of our component, we've got onSignInClick and onSignOutClick. Whenever we call those, we're going to essentially be accessing the auth2 instance. And that's going to start either the sign in flow or the sign out flow. Either way, this library is going to eventually call our onAuth change inside of our class or inside of our Google Auth component. In order to integrate Redux into this flow, we're going to make sure that any time that onAuth change is called, we call some appropriate action creator. So either an action creator called something like sign in or something called sign out. Now, these two action creators right here are going to be called anytime that the user successfully signs in or successfully signs out. So remember, just a moment ago, I had said, oh yeah, the name onSignIn or onSignOut was kind of unclear because it wasn't clear if that was the user completing the sign-in process or starting the sign-in process. So these action creators, their intent is to be called once the user has successfully signed in or successfully signed out. So when we call these action creators, they will return an action that's going to show up inside of a new reducer that's going to be called something like our auth reducer. This auth reducer is probably going to be an object or something like that is going to hold a simple Boolean value that reflects whether or not the user is currently signed in or signed out. Now, you might be kind of curious, why are we going to reflect whether the user is signed in or signed out inside of our Redux store? Because we are already recording that inside of our Google Auth component. Well, the reason for this is simple. Right now, only our Google Auth component knows whether the user is signed in or signed out. That is really inconvenient for a lot of the things that we want to eventually do inside of our application. Eventually, we are going to have entire screens and different components that are going to function very differently depending upon whether the user is signed in or signed out. And so we need to make sure that we have the fact of whether the user is signed in or signed out in some very centrally accessible location inside of our app. Having that inside this component is not centrally accessible. It would be very challenging for other components to somehow reach into this component and figure out if the user is signed in or signed out. So rather than leaving the state of whether the user is signed in or signed out inside this component alone, we're going to instead move that to our Redux store. So the Redux store is going to have a Boolean flag inside of it, either true or false, or null if we don't know if the user is signed in at any given time. That's going to reflect whether the user is signed in or signed out. This is going to lead to some kind of weird things, however. I want you to know that right now. We don't want to reflect whether the user is signed in multiple locations. We really want to reflect whether they are signed in or signed out in only one spot inside of our app. And so we're going to make that the Redux store. But then the side effect of that is that our Google Auth component needs to know whether to show the sign in or the sign out button. And it only knows which one to show depending upon whether or not the user is signed in or signed out. So we're going to make sure that the Redux store communicates whether the user is signed in or signed out as a prop through that map state to props function down to Google Auth. So the reason that I say that this is kind of awkward is that right now, this component has component level state that says whether or not the user is signed in. And so I'm now telling you that essentially we're going to take this little piece right here, or this little piece of state that says whether or not the user is signed in, and move it into the reducer, and then go through a ton of all the map state to props, all the connect function, all that nasty stuff, just to get this simple Boolean or null value back into the component. And so that's what I find is kind of awkward. We're going to remove some piece of data that is already into the component into some other location that is way harder to get access to, just to get it back inside the component anyways. Now, again, the reason that we are doing this is to make sure that other components can very easily read this data as well. Nonetheless, it will feel a little bit awkward when it comes back to refactoring the Google Auth component. Okay, so that's kind of my spiel around how we're going to do some of the Redux design around this component. Now, I want to show you an alternate way of designing our store here and designing the Redux side of the application. Now, this other way I'm going to show you, like I said, is following Redux conventions a little bit more closely, but it's also going to spread a lot of our authentication logic out all over our application. And so if you want to reference this Google Auth stuff in the future, it would be a lot harder to figure out the entire flow if you use this other approach, like so. Okay, so in this approach, the general idea is that we want to have our action creators always responsible for changing the state of our application. At present, with this flow, our Google Auth component right here is responsible for changing the state of our app. Like, truthfully, it really is, because this component is accessing the GAPI auth2 object right here. And this object right here kind of is a part of state of our application. So it's not really best practice to have a component manage state like that, but again, we're going to take that approach. Instead, it would be a little bit better approach to have our action creators manage access to that GAPI object instead. So in this approach, we would still have a Google Auth component, and it would still have some callback functions like onSign-in click or onSign-out click. Anytime someone invokes one of those callback functions, we would call an appropriate action creator, something named like try sign in or try sign out. Now, the reason that I named these try sign in and try sign out is to make sure that it's clear that these are going to attempt to sign the user in or attempt to sign the user out. It is the start or the beginning of the authentication process. So these action creators would essentially call this GAPI auth2 object right here. And then once the user is either signed in or signed out successfully, the GAPI object is still going to call some callback function called something like change auth. And this would also be an action creator. Change auth right here would be essentially equivalent to our current onChangeAuth function right here. So anytime that the user successfully signs in or signs out, change auth would be called. That would dispatch an action that would update our auth piece of state. And then just before, as in the last diagram, our Redux store would communicate whether or not the user is signed in or signed out through map state to props down to our Google Auth component. Okay, so like I said, this is an alternate approach that would follow conventions of Redux a little bit more closely because it is locking access to the GAPI object right here behind our action creators. At the end of the day, it's really not a big difference at all. I just want you to be aware that we could have taken this alternate approach and probably done just as well as what we're doing. Okay, so now that we understand the general idea here, let's take a quick pause. When we come back to the next video, we're going to start wiring Redux up to our project and implementing these action creators and some auth reducer as well. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.